Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. I hope you guys are all having a fantastic Wednesday. Today I wanted to answer a pretty common question I get asked, and that is, why is my gecko not eating? Now this applies to all sorts of different geckos, not just crested geckos, and this is a comment I get asked pretty often, and it's actually pretty easy. So why is your gecko not eating? Well, before we can dive into that, there's two things you should know before getting a gecko, and really any animal, and that is obviously make sure you're picking out a healthy animal. And for crested gecko specifically, make sure you're not getting one that's too thin or the eyes are really sunk in or it just looks unhealthy for whatever reason. This is going to be your starting point. Before you even get a gecko, is make sure you're getting one that you know is healthy. That's going to solve a lot of your problems right off the bat. And another thing to look out for that specifically relates to crested geckos, gargoyle geckos, leachianus geckos is making sure you're getting a gecko that has not been raised on eating only bugs. You want to make sure you're getting a gecko that's been eating powdered food along with bugs, because getting a gecko that's been raised on bugs can be a little bit hard to transition them over, and also just the fact that it can lead to health problems down the road depending on how old they are and how long they've only been eating bugs for. Now the next question to ask yourself is, what kind of gecko is this? Is this a gecko you just got? Whether it be from online, an expo, the pet store, doesn't matter, a new gecko to you, or is this a gecko you've had for a while? Now when I get asked this question, why is my gecko not eating? Typically it's relating to geckos that people have just received. And this is probably the more common one, so let's talk about that first. So it's not unusual at all for geckos not to eat a whole lot in the first 1, 2, 3, maybe even month that you've had them. Especially in those first couple weeks, it's pretty rare that they're going to clean out their bowl. Obviously they're getting adjusted to their new home, whether they were shipped to you or whether you got them from the pet store. They're still going to be in a new location and a new habitat, and they got to get used to it. So you might see them take a few licks, you might not. But really, it's pretty common, I would say, for geckos not to eat in the first couple weeks of being in a new home. With that being said, though, my follow-up question to that after someone tells me their gecko isn't eating is it pooping? And you might say, well, why is that? Well, by logic, if your gecko is eating a little bit or it has some food in its stomach, it is going to release feces, and therefore your gecko is probably eating. Another thing to keep in mind is that these animals, especially crested geckos, leopard geckos, any kind of gecko really, are all relatively small, so the amount of food that they're going to eat is very tiny. And then you also have to factor in that when you first get them, they're probably not going to eat a full portion to begin with, which is already really small. So that's just something to keep in mind. But for the most part, if you're getting a new animal and it's not eating, I would not worry about it unless it's going over a couple weeks. And especially if you're seeing poop in the enclosure, then you're set. And it can take a while for them to get adjusted. And one more thing on the subject of getting a new gecko, I have never ever switched over to a different food specifically for a gecko. And what I mean is, if I got a gecko from somebody who I know feeds only Repashy, I didn't go out of my way and buy more Repashy to feed that specific gecko. I've just swapped them in with the rotation that I'm doing on Pangea, which is usually what I feed here. And I've never ever had an issue with any of the geckos transitioning over to Pangea. Now, if you're very worried about your gecko eating and you want to ask the breeder or wherever you got it from what they're eating and you want to try that, if it would make you feel better, I would say definitely go for it. But I'm just letting you know that out of all the hundreds of geckos I've had over the years, I've never ever done that. And I've never had an issue with any geckos eating, except for one, which is actually my most recent gecko. The one I got in my last unboxing from Pangea is having a little bit of a struggle starting to eat, which is weird, but that's for a different video. But that just might be an anomaly. I've never had trouble with the 100 other geckos I've gotten online or from expos or anything like that. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, the second question is, if this is a gecko that you've had for a while, maybe 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, a year, 10 years, and it stops eating, that's a little bit different than when you have a gecko that you just got, just because this gecko should be used to your food, used to your habitats, that kind of thing. So this makes it a little bit more tricky, but it's still pretty easy to correct. And there's a couple things that I would look for if you're having this issue on a gecko you've owned for a while already. So the first thing I would say is, what time of year is it? Because here in Wisconsin, at least up in the north, our seasons fluctuate, from 100 to 90 degrees in the summer, all the way to negative 20 sometimes in the winter. So it really fluctuates, and I've noticed over the years that my geckos do eat a lot less in winter, just because even though they're in my house, it is still colder outside. The overall ambient temperature in my house is a little bit cooler, in the low 70s versus in the high 70s, and that really makes the world of difference when your geckos are eating in their metabolism. So first, maybe check what time of year is it. If it's turning into winter time and they're eating a little bit less, that's very normal. That's not uncommon at all. The next thing kind of leading into that, like I said, the temperature is obviously probably one of the bigger ones too, is because if it's warmer, your gecko's metabolism is going to be higher, they're going to be eating more, that sort of thing. If it's too cold, they're going to slow down eating, they might not eat at all for a little while, or they might not eat as much. I feed my geckos every other day here, no matter what season it is, but I definitely notice that the geckos in winter eat nowhere near as much as they do in summer. I mean, I'm talking even crickets, powdered food, it doesn't matter. They're just not eating as much. It's a little bit cooler, the metabolism's slower, so that's why I get the best growth here in summer. Now, if it's neither of those things, if your temps are good, the year is, still summertime and your gecko's not eating, the next thing I would move on to is maybe the habitat. What is different in their enclosure? Is anything different? Would they be stressed to come out and eat for some reason? A change in an apartment, a change in a house, anything like that can make a difference too. Like, do you have a pet cat that's sitting on the top of their enclosure, watching them when they're eating? Things that are going to stress them out. Kids running around, all the time, loud music playing, anything like that that could stress them out, that would make them not eat. That's another big one too when it comes to getting crested geckos to eat. I mean, if you're playing music in your room or you have people talking in your room, that's not going to do it. But like if you have a pet cat that's constantly giving them the death stare, that's going to stress them out when they're trying to eat. Another thing to consider is the overall stress level, kind of like I just mentioned with the cat scenario. If you have a bright light shining on your gecko 24/7, obviously they're a more diurnal animal. They're going to come out when it's dark. And if you have this bright light on them, they're going to stay holed up in their little hidey hole and they're not going to come out and eat. And I mean, there's a lot of things that can cause stress. I mean, if they're too dry, they're too humid, too bright a light, other animals around that they feel threatened by, a whole host of things. And so really you got to ask yourself, is there anything out of the norm that's been going on that could change their habits? And then the last one is probably the most unlikely, I would say, in my opinion, just at least for crested geckos, gargo geckos, leachianus geckos, but it could be possible that they have some sort of sickness. Are they developing MBD? Do they have some sort of parasite? All the New Caledonian geckos are pretty hardy in general. So that's why I put this last on the list, because it can be easy to jump to that as your first conclusion. Oh my God, my gecko's sick. What's going on with him? He's got to have some parasite or something. However, the chances of that, if you've been taking good care of him, and being some sort of illness like MBD or developing that or anything like that is pretty rare. It's pretty uncommon, I would say, if they've been getting a good diet. I mean, it can just happen by chance depending on if you're feeding them feeder bugs and all sorts of things like that. But I definitely put this last on your list of concerns as to why they might not be eating. But if you're really concerned about it, it might be best to take them to the vet if you can find some distinguishable sign that says they have a parasite or they're developing MBD they really can't do anything about. But if they have some sort of parasite, it might be best to take them to the vet if you feel that is necessary. But I would definitely go through the other things higher up on this list first, because there's a good chance it's one of those things. But that's all I have for you guys today. If there's something that wasn't in this video that you feel like I missed, please leave a comment down below. I'm sure other people would really appreciate it. And I can definitely understand why a lot of people have this concern. Obviously, it's very nerve-wracking when you get a new animal, whether you're a first-time keeper or you've just had a couple animals, and you get this new animal, and you're all excited, and then it's not eating, and it can really worry you and freak you out. But the only thing I can say is that most gecko species, and especially crested geckos, leopard geckos, that kind of thing, are very hardy. Leopard geckos are a little bit different. I'm specifically talking about crested geckos here. But crested geckos and all the New Caledonian geckos are very hardy in general. So I would just say, don't worry about it as much. Just try and look at the signs and see if there's anything you can do to hopefully remedy it at home without having to go to the vet or something like that if you think it's sick. But with that being said, hopefully this video helped you out. Hopefully it calmed you down a little bit if you were very worried. And I hope to see you in my next video.